And so I appreciate the words of Gareth's prayer there, because, well, scarcely can you not be aware of the circumstances in our world at the moment. And it's largely for this reason that the book of Daniel is of such help to us, not just because of the nation's rage, and we see kings and kingdoms in a sense in our modern terms, waging war against one another, but also the kings and kingdoms of ideas, and people that subscribe to ideas that rise and fall, that come and go, and the pressure to conform, the pressure to compromise and fall in line, and how the book of Daniel helps us, and how the book of Daniel reminds us of what we need to know here, today, now, to strengthen and encourage us. So it was wonderful to pray together, and I trust that the Lord would now fortify us by his word. A few moments ago, you may have heard Darcy cry out. That is a not unfamiliar sound in the middle of the night in the Hillman household. Not always Darcy, often other children as well. But as a father, and this would be true for Emma also as a mother, I can think of numerous times when I've had to help one of my children in the middle of the night who has woken up upset. And if you've had that experience, you'll know that very often they're still half asleep, and it's very difficult to placate a half-awake child because they're not quite there. There's a sense in which they kind of remain stuck in the bad dream that they've had, or the night terror, whatever it may have been. They're not fully awake, but they're clearly upset. And all you can really do until they're settled is reassure them of your presence. The other night, my youngest had become very upset, and all I could do was repeat the words, "It's okay, Dad is here." And you repeat that until eventually settled. Both the meaning of the message and the voice of the one who speaks it begins to calm the one who is troubled, in this case, a child, the reassurance that is offered. And this is true regarding the book of Daniel. This is true regarding these words that we are traversing through at the moment during a time of exile for God's people. God's repeated message to a troubled people that calms, steadies, and strengthens the soul in a day of difficulty. Our very first week in the book of Daniel focused largely on the headline that I repeated many times, should have said it many times since, in the fifth week we're now in with regards to this series, but the repeated line, God has a loving plan for his people at all times. God has a loving plan for his people at all times. That is what the book of Daniel, I believe, declares, alongside other messages as well, but it is a reminder, even in the worst of times, even when we're not where we long to be, physically speaking, God still has a loving plan for us. And of course, we speak bigger picture as well, because we are reminded in the book of Daniel of the fragility of life. And the second half of the book is going to remind us that God has an eternal plan for us as well. But this headline, that God has a loving plan for his people at all times, this good news increasingly fortifies our hearts and minds and souls when we remember that the God who makes this promise, who announces this to us through his word, is both mighty and merciful. It's of no good to me, and it's of no good to you if our God is only a God of good intentions. But if God is mighty and merciful, if he is the Lord of hosts, if he is the Lord Almighty, all-knowing, all-loving, then this truly is a word to strengthen us in the day of difficulty. If he is the Most High, and if he rules on high, then we have a place to find hope and comfort and strength today. And that's been the recurring message of God to his people in exile and to the nations. The world shouts to be heard and to have our attention. The world craves our allegiance and commands our compromise. But God calls out to those who are his, even in a far-off place. He says, "You may have left the land, but I have not left you." He says, "I'm still for you and I'm still in control. I'm outworking my purposes for my glory and for your good. And to an exiled people, the God of Daniel says, I am the God who blesses. I am the God who saves. I am the God who rules the nations. I am the God whose rule and reign will have no end. I am the God who humbles the proud and exalts the humble. And so in a world that cries out, craving our allegiance and commanding our compromise, we need to hear the call of God. And we need to hear his voice spoken over us in the way that a child needs to hear a parent, to find that which would calm our fears and calm our frailty, to know that he wields his sovereign power with grace for our ultimate good. That is what Daniel is reminding us of as we read these words to a people in exile. There's so many people shouting for our attention. It's true in the world today. The marches that took place yesterday, one march shouting one thing, another march shouting another, all commanding our attention, all commanding our allegiance. But where is the voice of God? And what is the word that we will hold to? Well, here is a word for us this morning that would calm, steady, and strengthen your soul. A God who is in control and a God who has a loving plan for you. And this remains the key theme as we move on. And so we reach Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5 this morning. And in the manner that we've been doing so over these last few weeks, we are going to work section by section through this, sometimes simply offering summary, sometimes delving into the passage itself. But by the time we reach Daniel chapter 5, as we're about to discover, so much has changed. 30 years have passed, with Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, now occupying the Babylonian throne. 30 years have passed. And the once influential Daniel seems initially, by what we soon read of, seems to be far from that prominent place he had held under Nebuchadnezzar. It drifted into the background somewhat, not in the Lord's eyes, but certainly the rulers of Babylon have less use for him for a time. Beyond Babylon, under the rule of Cyrus, the mighty Medo-Persian Empire is casting further uncertainty for all that sit under the rule of Babylon. So God's people, much has changed. They're in exile, many of them in exile, much has changed. The ruler within Babylon has changed. There's another empire that are moving, that are a threat to Babylon. Even now in these moments, it seems, despite Belshazzar burying his head in the sand. So much uncertainty, so much change. But God has not changed, and neither has the message to his people and to the nations. So let's start in verse 1, where we find out what's going on. Verse 1 of chapter 5 in the book of Daniel. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. And Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Belshazzar, in a not dissimilar way to his grandfather, and certainly how he once was, has a flair for self-indulgence and self-exaltation. An opportunity, it seems, before him to parade his pomp and his power, as these lords, 1,000 of them have been gathered together, wives assembled also, concubines in their midst, and he drinks wine before them. And then, remembering that his grandfather took these vessels out of Jerusalem, decides to bring them out, and in again, not dissimilar way to his grandfather, shows his power and his prominence, at least as he perceives it, by drinking from these vessels. He arranges this banquet and parades his power in front of those that have been gathered, the well-to-do of his kingdom that have been brought together to acknowledge him and his throne. Self-exaltation and self-indulgence. The final words of Nebuchadnezzar that we read in Daniel 4 must have felt a very distant memory for God's people living in exile. For in these moments, Belshazzar mocks God. Let's be clear what is happening here. Whether Belshazzar would phrase it in this way or not, his actions are an attempt to mock God by drinking from these vessels as he toasts God, gods made of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood and stone, which are, of course, no gods at all. Lumps of matter hewn together by human hands. But for all his flexing, Belshazzar is about to look very weak indeed. Verse 5. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand, visible for all to see here in this moment. What a terrifying moment it must have been to have this hand visible. This isn't a dream like Nebuchadnezzar's has. This is visible. And the king saw the hand as it wrote, and then the king's colour changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." And all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his colour changed, and his lords were perplexed. Belshazzar is terrified by this turn of events. Such a transformation in the blink of an eye. There is a king who is flexing and showing his power and his dominance in front of all these lords that have been gathered together. And then this appearance of a hand by the lampstand that writes upon the wall. And how this king now appears as one who has fallen and full of fear in these moments. And with very clear echoes to Nebuchadnezzar's experiences earlier, Belshazzar calls for the wise men to make sense of the writing that is now appearing upon the walls of the palace. The echoes continue as the wise men fail in this regard. And not for the first time, the limitations of human power and knowledge are revealed, and will be set in contrast to the almighty hand of God. And that's when Belshazzar's wife, this moment, this circus that is going on in terms of Belshazzar attempting to demonstrate his power, now brought down to fear because of what has appeared before him, Belshazzar's wife remembers about Daniel. And how 30 years prior to this, Daniel had been a key cog in Nebuchadnezzar's working kingdom because he had been the one who had granted wisdom and knowledge. Actually, God had, of course, been the revealer of mysteries in these matters. But Belshazzar's wife reminds the king that there is one who has offered interpretation on such things before, who has wisdom that has been given by the Spirit of God, as it says in these words here. Of course, we would be more specific and say the Spirit of God, the Most High. And so Belshazzar's wife tells him about Daniel, and then we pick up in verse 13. Verse 13 of Daniel chapter 5. Then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel." And that shows that he no longer has a relationship here with Daniel, unlike Nebuchadnezzar did. "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the Spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not show me the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." So Daniel is summoned. He's brought before the king, who is fearful. He wants answers. He needs interpretation. and he is prepared to give this man Daniel, who he has no relationship with, power and prestige and wealth if he is able to interpret the writing on the wall. He's offered wealth and power. Belshazzar assumes he knows what Daniel wants because this is what he has wanted in life, power and prestige. He has no understanding at all of what Daniel wants. Daniel understands the material things for what they really are. Yes, they can be enjoyed. Yes, they can be a blessing. But Daniel does not seek after these things first and foremost. And so in these moments, Daniel is already beginning to show his allegiance to the Lord because that's not what he craves. What this king offers is not what he craves. He longs to honour a king who is sat upon a higher throne. Daniel is stood before the king and he longs to honour God. And that becomes apparent because the words that Daniel now speaks to Belshazzar are not perhaps what we expect, because he doesn't start with an interpretation, but rather a challenge, and even verging on an accusation towards Belshazzar for his foolishness, for not having heard the testimony of his own grandfather who had announced the greatness of God Most High. He's been brought to offer interpretation, but first he places a challenge before Belshazzar, even in these moments an accusation against him. So again, now we turn to our passage and we pick up in verse 18. O King, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he killed, and whom he would he kept alive. Whom he would he raised up, and whom he would he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast. His dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven. Until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. Though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honoured. Then from his presence the hand was sent. And this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. You imagine Belshazzar in this moment, having heard his wife announce that Daniel is a man who can help out in these moments. Daniel comes before him, and what he hears is perhaps not what he expects. It's certainly not what he's encountered before in these moments where these other lords have played their part in this pageantry that has been taking place here, and in a sense paid lip service to the pretense that here is a great and high and mighty king who stands before them. Daniel, on the other hand, in these moments presents a challenge to him. You know, all the others, as they appeared before the king, whether it's Belshazzar or Nebuchadnezzar prior to him, they often announce, "O king, live forever," before they begin to speak to the Babylonian ruler. Of course, Daniel will not pay lip service to that pretense. He knows each one of us has an end. And he challenges Belshazzar in these moments. He reminds him about how his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, was humbled, this powerful king who was brought low and became like a beast of the field. And all of this happened so that Nebuchadnezzar would come to know that the Most High God rules. Verse 21 in Daniel chapter 5 reminds us of the message announced 4 times in Daniel chapter 4. And with no attempt to sugarcoat matters for the king, Daniel tells Belshazzar that he's making the same mistakes that his grandfather once did. If you remember, there was always a sense in which Daniel spoke with compassion and care for King Nebuchadnezzar. But here Daniel's tone is different. It's as though he's saying, you should have known. You've had testimony, you've had witness, you've had evidences, but look at you. Mock God and show him no honour. To show the one in whose hands is your breath no honour. All his ways are in your hands, and you disregard him. Instead, you drink from the vessels you took from his house, and you toast gods made of stone and iron and bronze and silver and gold that are no gods at all. It is the Most High God who rules and reigns. He has put you in this place of power. He holds all your ways in his hands. Even the very breath you take is in his hands. In other words, Belshazzar, you are not all powerful and you are not invincible. Everything to this point in his court has been pandering to the pretense, but not Daniel. He honours God in these moments and speaks ultimately mercifully to Belshazzar. Don't miss the mercy that is in these words. When Daniel points out the error of Belshazzar's way, he is trying to provoke a response in him. Repent. Turn. Turn from self-interest, self-indulgence, self-exaltation, and turn towards God. That's the warning. That's the mercy. That's the grace. Wake up. See the folly of your way. Remember the testimony of your grandfather. And then Daniel reads the writing on the wall for the king. Your kingdom is coming to an end. You have been weighed and found wanting. Your kingdom will fall to another. In other words, God will not be mocked and you will be called to account. And then the passage ends rather abruptly, perhaps seeking to emphasize the folly and finality of this earthly king. At the end of the passage, then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. That very night, King Belshazzar died, and the once mighty Babylonian kingdom came to an end in an instant. For all its power, for the extent of the kingdom, it came to an end in a moment. And what commenced in Daniel chapter 5 with a foolish king parading his power concludes with a kingdom brought to its end. And it's such a sad demise because, it's as though he's heard what Daniel's had to say, but there's no response. He simply does what he said he'd do. Here is a robe of purple, and here is the power I'm going to offer you, and here is the gold chain, and then his end. He doesn't say, I hear what you're saying, Daniel. He doesn't say, I recognize now how foolish I have been, Daniel. And I'm going to humble myself under the God Most High. He continues on completely unchanged. And I realize to this point we have only sought to summarize what is presented in Daniel 5, but I want to very briefly consider 2 messages in this passage. And I will be brief, we're coming to a close with this. There's 2 messages here. First, the message to the nations. Let's not forget that, as I've said before in this, the first 7 chapters, chapter 2 to 7 rather, in the book of Daniel are written in Aramaic. They were written in a language that was accessible to the Near East in this time, that this was a kind of universal language that would have been accessible. And so this book is a book not only for God's people to offer them hope and strength and courage, it's an announcement to the nations that the Most High rules and that he is both mighty and merciful. That's what we see in the story of Nebuchadnezzar, who keeps making the same mistake until eventually God in his mercy knocks down the walls of resistance, and we have there a confession of faith, a turning to him of sorts in this moment. Not for Belshazzar, but here nonetheless is a word of mercy and grace. Acknowledge me. Recognize that your breath is held in my hands, and your ways in my hands also. So there is a message here that God speaks to the nations. There is in this story, for as abrupt as it feels, for as abrasive as it feels to our society today, a word of mercy and grace. Let Belshazzar be a warning to you, God says to the nations. Understand that there is one in whose hands your every breath is held. And then there's a message to God's people, message to the nations, and then a message for God's people. What is the message of Daniel 5 for God's people? Well, it is simply this, and it is a message that has been repeated already in our series. God is saying, I am still in control, and my promises still stand. You know, before God handed Israel over to their captors, God made a promise to his people that he would deal with mighty Babylon. For as terrifying as this empire that besieged Jerusalem and carried the southern kingdom of Judah off into captivity, for as terrifying as they appeared, God said, yes, they are my tool that is bringing judgment upon you for your waywardness, but I will not depart from you, I will be with you. And in time I will deal with those who stand against you, and I will bring low the mighty kingdom of Babylon. And Habakkuk and Jeremiah and Isaiah, they all announced God's promise that a day was coming when he would deal with Babylon. A voice, a cry from Babylon, the noise of great destruction from the land of the Chaldeans. For the Lord is laying Babylon to waste and stilling her mighty voice. God made a promise to his people. God has made many promises to his people, and God is saying in these moments, I'm still in control and my promises still stand. And more than that as well, in this moment, the things that are taking place, just as a time when uncertainty must have been growing, because it wasn't just that Babylon came to an end, but now the mighty Medo-Persian Empire comes to a rise, and God's people must have been thinking, well, what next? What now? And as we continue on in the history of God's people, we'll see what's coming. We'll begin to learn and see what God's doing in and through all this. But in this moment, when the tides of power are turning, God brings Daniel back into the courts of the king. So that just as Belshazzar comes to an end and Darius comes to the rise, there is Daniel, God's man, in the right place at the right time. God is in control. God who is mighty and merciful. God who has a loving plan for his people at all times, even the very worst of times. I just want to close with this. I started off at the beginning by saying that as parents, there are times when we have those moments where we try to calm our children's fears, and sometimes, especially when they're young, all we can do is repeat that message and reassure them of our presence. And how we as his children long to hear our Father's voice and his words, especially today when the world shouts so loudly, we want to hear his voice. On Wednesday, we were reminded that the Psalms, though written over a period of hundreds of years, were ultimately collated into the book that we now have during the period of the exile. And you think how much God's people needed these words, how much they needed these songs and these prayers. And there is a psalm that speaks to us wonderfully, the message of Daniel chapter 5. And for many, they will be very familiar words, but I want to close with these words and these words alone from Psalm 46. And I just want you to hear them. God's word, God the Father, speaking to you today in this world that shouts so loudly, craves your allegiance, commands your compromise. Hear now his voice. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear though the earth give way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice and the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. And here is God's word for you as a father quiets his troubled child. Hear his voice and his word for you, as it was for those in exile. Be still. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The Lord of heaven's armies is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Amen.